Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at some techniques for shading and texturing in Photoshop. So you can maybe use some of these techniques for your turnaround images when you're trying out different color schemes, things like that. So primarily I want to show you a couple of options that might make it easier to control where you're actually painting or drawing on your kind of inked turnaround images. So what we're going to do is take a look at clipping masks or clipping layers, and also the transparency lock option on your layers as well. Both of them can help you keep all of your ink within the lines that you've designated, or within the colored areas that you've laid down your base colors in, like you can see here on the image, without having to go back and erase a bunch of ink or pixels that end up outside the line work, if you're trying to avoid that kind of thing. So it basically helps you speed up your shading and coloring process. So I'm going to start off. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create just some basic shade on the front view using one method, and then I'm going to create some texture on the second view, the 3/4, using the other option or the other technique. But you can use either technique for doing either your, any of your coloring or your shading or your texturing, anything like that. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the front view. So let's just kind of zoom in here. I'm going to go into my front view group just here, because we'll be adding some extra layers in. And you can see that I've got my orange fill from last time. I've got my green fill layer as well. And I also have a white fill, and that's for the teeth, which you won't be able to see very well unless I turn off the background, because they're almost white. Okay, so they're just a very slightly off-white color. Okay, so let's say I want to add in some basic shading onto the character to kind of make it look a little bit more three-dimensional instead of this very flat looking image. The first method I'm going to show you is a clipping mask method. Now this is what we call a non-destructive method. In essence, what it's going to allow us to do is use additional layers to paint on, which we can then mask out using the existing color layers that we already have. So in other words, the new shade that we paint on our new layers will only be visible where it overlaps the existing color layers. That's basically called a clipping mask or a clipping layer. Similar processes can be used in Illustrator. You can use objects to clip one another out. And you can also do a similar thing using what's called a track matte in After Effects. So they quite often are equivalent processes that can give you a very similar result in different software. Okay, so I'm going to start off by creating some shade on the character's body on this one. And so what I will be doing is looking to add some shade over where the orange area is. Okay, so the body, the head. And you can see that that's that layer there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a layer above the orange fill layer. So just create a new layer like that. Don't forget, you can go to layer, new layer up here, or just hit the button at the bottom of the panel. And what I'm going to do is call this one orange shade. Like that, orange shade. Okay, so it's important that I name all of these as I go along. That way I know which one is which. Now what I'm going to do, with this we could use any of the processes we've used before. I can just use the paintbrush to draw it in. I could use one of the lasso selection tools to create a selection and then fill it. You can produce the actual ink work for the shading however you like, but I'm just going to use a brush because it's quicker. So what I'm going to do is select a darker color of my base color in order to make the shade. In essence, you know, we're creating a shade over the same surface. It's just a slightly less lit. So it means it's just going to be a darker version of that orange. So what I'm going to do is hold down my Alt key to get my eyedropper. I can also select the eyedropper from over here and then select it. Then what I'm going to do is come down into my little swatch here, click on that, and then what I can do is just drag the little indicator here vertically down, and that's going to give me a darker version of the color. And you can see the beginning color that I started with, or the current color, and then the new color that I will get if I hit OK. So I'm just going to make sure that that's across as far as I can get it. It's a little bit inaccurate trying to get it across there with the mouse. Now, this is also becoming slightly brown, because brown is, generally speaking, a darker version of orange. I want to try and get a little bit more saturated with that. So what I'm going to do is just drop the I'm going to drop this hue value down slightly so it's approaching red a little bit more, and that's going to warm that color up slightly. But obviously, you know, you can work your colors out how you like. So I'll just hit OK. So I've got that that darker orange there now. All right. Okay, so I've got my orange shade. I've got my color. I'm just going to quickly squiggle with my brush just to make sure it's drawing the way I want, which it is. You know, I can go back into the brush settings and adjust things in here if I like, you know, things like the hardness of the brush and so on, but I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to kind of put the color in, and I'm not going to worry about the clipping mask just yet. Then what I'm going to do is show you the result of that when I activate the clipping mask. So my sunlight, I'm going to have my sunlight coming from this direction. Okay, so the sun's going to be over here, which means everything on this side of his body is going to be in shadow. So for instance, I might have sort of something in there. Because he's got this very heavy set brow, what I'm going to do is bring that in there like that, and then I'm also going to have that sort of there, and I'm following it on from sort of where the top is, and then over here I'm going to offset that a little bit. So everything else is going to be on this side of his body is going to be this darker color like this. Okay. Now obviously I can go in and clean that up a little bit, so I can grab my eraser and just remove some of that, and I can smooth that line out a little bit like that. So I'm going to have something along these lines, right? Now I can do the same thing down here with his body. I'm looking at where that's landing, that the edge of that shadow, and I'm going to bring it down roughly about the same point. I can offset it a little bit if I like. But I'm going to bring it down like that. And where his forearm is, what I might do is actually have maybe part of his hand is slightly forward, and so it's not quite being shadowed by his body. So what I might do there is perhaps sort of have the shadow up the back of his arm like that, shadowed there. But then what I might do is sort of make it look like his hand's kind of forward a little bit, so it's not completely shadowing entirely. So I can just sort of bring that across like that. Now keep in mind, at the moment my orange shade is underneath the other layers, like the green fill. So where I've been painting down here, it hasn't been going outside the lines because this green fill is above it. So if I turn the green fill off, you can see there's actually parts of the shade. I don't need to worry about that because it sort of looks okay already. But you can see here I've gone out of the lines a fair deal, like a fair amount there. So what I want to do is I want to sort of fix that a little bit. And I'm going to do that with a clipping, like a clipping mask. So something like that. So in order to activate the clipping mask, what I can do is bring my cursor over to the layer panel, hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and move the cursor down in between the layer I'm colouring on and the layer below, and you'll get this little icon, a little square with a down arrow. So when I click, oops, it's hard with the cursor, what happens is the layer thumbnail insets, and you can see that anything that was outside of the lines, anything that was outside the orange fill area, so if I turn off the, let's turn the line work off, anything that was outside this orange fill layer has vanished. So what's happening is the orange fill is basically saying to the orange shade layer, you can only display where you are overlapping this layer. And so that's how we can quickly add shade using a clipping mask. Okay, so if I turn the clipping mask off, that's what it looks like. And if I turn it back on, it looks like that. So you can see there we get our shade pretty quickly. So that's a clipping mask. Now the other option, now that's non-destructive as well, I should point out. If I mess that shade up, all I have to do is delete the contents of the orange shade layer, or just delete that layer entirely, add a new layer and start again with the shading. Okay, I can turn that layer off. I could add another layer in. So if I add another layer, okay, if I add that as an active clipping layer, I could actually do some shading the other way around. You see, and notice how as I draw out here, nothing happens. So if I wanted the sun coming in or the light source to be coming in from the other angle, I could experiment with that as well by doing the shading around this way. Now obviously where your shading is overlapping with the base layer or the fill layer, you've still got to be careful. You know, you've still got to clean that up a little bit. But the clipping mask or the clipping layer will just stop it going outside of the lines, like that. So I can experiment with different shading angles by having different clipping masks or different clipping layers, like that. Okay. So let's now talk about pixel locking or transparency locking on layers. This is a little bit of a different process. This is slightly destructive because what we're going to be doing is actually shading directly on the fill layers that we've already created. Okay. So, because this is destructive, and if I mess things up, I basically have to try and go back. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my 3/4 groups. I'm going to duplicate all of this and work on a duplicate. That way, if I mess it up, I can just delete this duplicate group and all the duplicate layers in it, and then just go back to my original and duplicate it again and start again. Okay, so I'm going to drag the whole group down onto the plus button, and that's going to duplicate it. And you can see it's now called copy. So this is my original, just here, and this is my copy group. Okay, note that it doesn't add copy to the layers inside, just the group name. Okay, so if I screw things up, I can just delete this whole group and go back to my original one. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to select my original group, I'm going to lock it, and then I'm going to turn it off. Okay, so it's out of the way. So what I'm seeing here at the moment is this duplicate copy group. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use transparency locking on my layers so that I can't draw outside the lines. Okay, now for this one I'm going to have a bit of a play around with some different textures rather than it just being shading. So I'm going to add some texture to this. I'm going to select a slightly darker version of the color for the skin to begin with, and I'm going to pop in and use the brush preset that I created in one of my other videos. So I've got this little speckle paving brush here, and what I need to do is just a couple of brush strokes. What I can do is add an extra layer in just to kind of scribble on so I can see how big the brush is. So that's sort of the brush as it stands at the moment. I'm going to make a couple of tweaks to this just so that I can kind of get the look that I'm going for. I'm going to add in some transfer in the transfer settings, and this is my opacity. So if I increase the opacity jitter, what it's going to do is it's going to randomly select a transparency or an opacity setting for each stamp of the brush it does while I'm drawing, up to a value of 82% in this case, or whatever number you set. So roughly, I'm going to set roughly about 80. So if I randomly draw, you can see that it's giving me different level speckles, right? Now the other thing I can do is I can drop the opacity of the whole brush down as well. And I kind of want to do that. I don't want it to be too dark. So I can draw it like this, and it's going to be quite see-through. That might be a little bit too see-through, so I might just increase that to about 50. Yeah, that's a bit better. So I can kind of test things there. Now I also want the brush to be a little bit bigger, so I'm going to increase that to about 60 or 70. Yeah, something like that. Maybe a bit bigger. Yeah, about there. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so it's always handy to have an extra layer active just so that you can scribble on it and then just get rid of it when you don't need it. Okay, so for this method, which is transparency locking or pixel locking, what I'm going to do is select my cyan fill layer, which is the skin color, like this, and I'm going to come up to the panel just above where we've got lock, and I'm going to select the first option. Okay, this option here is called lock transparent pixels. So anything on this layer that doesn't already have color in it will be locked, and I won't be able to draw on it. So I'm going to click that, and you can see I get this unfilled padlock just here. So what that means is I can't draw over here anywhere because there's no pixels there. To show that there's no pixels there, I'm going to turn off the background color. So anywhere where there's these transparent checkerboard patterns, I can't draw. But if I come over and I draw here, you can see that the texture shows up because these green pixels or these cyan pixels are here. So what I can do is very quickly go down and add this texture to the character, and I don't have to worry that it's going to go off the edges of the drawing, so I don't have to go and delete any of that sort of excess afterwards. So I can go in and basically add this kind of scaly texture to him as a bit of a skin texture, like that. Now, earlier I was saying that this is a destructive process. I'm actually drawing directly on the fill. So if I try and delete what I've just done using the eraser, if I'm not happy with how much of this texture I've put on, I can't remove the texture separately to the fill because it's all on one layer, and that's the problem. That's the downside with doing it this way. So what you would have to do is undo back. So if you're using transparency locking on your layers, if you're using that process, you have to be aware that you can't separate those pixels from the base color anymore. You would have to use the undo function in the software, which is under edit undo just here. You'd have to use that to go back. So as you're working, just be very careful. If you do a brush stroke that you're not happy with, like if I do that, for instance, and it ends up over here, I need to undo straight away. Okay, that way it's going to allow me to kind of keep it pretty clean. So I can add my texture in, like that. Maybe put some on his stomach. And then I can go through and do shading, just like I did with the other one. And for that, what I might do is actually use a clipping mask. Oops, didn't want to delete it. So I can add another layer and use that as a clipping mask. So I can clip that in. And then what I can do is set my brush to a standard brush, like that. I'll keep the opacity up. I'll do the opacity at 100 for this. Let's have a quick look here. Jump into the settings. I'm just going to change the shape dynamics here and set the brush size to pen pressure, and that way the harder I push down with my stylus, the thicker the line gets. Okay, so something like that should be okay. And what I can do now, I've got my darker color in. Let me go a little bit darker with that color, so I can actually do that over here as well. I want to go quite dark with that. And what I can do now on my new layer, which I will name Skin Shadow. Okay, what I can do is add that color in like this. And because it's a clipping mask already, a clipping layer, I don't have to worry about going off the edge like this. And then I can go through the eraser and just clean those edges up. There we go. And yeah, once I've done that, because the shadow is on a separate layer, I can then adjust the opacity until I'm happy with how dark it is. So I can have the shadow a little darker than the texture, or I can have the shadow a lot lighter than the texture if I want a more subtle lighting. And potentially you could also play around with the blending mode, which is this drop down just here. So if I highlight that blending mode and then use my down arrow like this, I can actually go and tweak the settings of that blending mode for the layer in order to get sort of different variations. Some of them won't do anything, some of them will have drastic changes, some you know, will be a lot more subtle. So I can play around with that as well. So something like that perhaps, a little bit desaturated so it's more in the blue spectrum. Just clean that up a little bit more. Okay. So there we go. Yeah, so clipping masks and pixel transparency locks on your layers. Try those out if you're doing your colouring in Photoshop. You might find that they're handy and they might speed up your workflow for cleaning up your turnaround images. I'll leave this video here and I'll see you guys soon.